On the morning of the 8th of March, 1968, a Soviet naval officer named Vladimir Kobzar sat in the command chair of the K-129 somewhere in the North Pacific and made a routine notation in the ship's log. The submarine was running on diesel engines at periscope depth. The sea was calm. The crew of 98 men was at their stations. 3 nuclear missiles sat in their launch tubes, each one carrying a warhead with a yield of 1 megaton, each one pointed at a city on the west coast of the United States. This was a routine patrol. Nothing unusual. Kobzar had done it before. Then something happened. We do not know what. The K-129 never sent another radio transmission. It never reported crossing the 180th meridian. It never arrived at its patrol station. It simply stopped. The Soviet Pacific Fleet waited for their submarine to make contact. When it didn't, they waited longer. By the 3rd week of March, the K-129 was declared missing. In April, the largest submarine search in Soviet naval history began. Ships combed thousands of square miles of the Pacific for weeks. They found nothing. What the Soviets did not know, and what would not become public for nearly 30 years, was that the United States Navy had heard the submarine die. A classified network of underwater microphones called SOSUS had been listening to the Pacific since the 1950s. On the day K-129 disappeared, those sensors recorded the acoustic signature of a catastrophic implosion. The Americans cross-referenced the signals, calculated the coordinates, and knew within weeks exactly where the submarine had gone down. While Soviet ships searched hundreds of miles away, the U.S. Navy submarine USS Halibut was already heading toward the real location. The Halibut was not a standard submarine. It had been converted into a deep-sea spy platform carrying a towed camera system called the Fish, 12 feet of cameras and strobe lights, built to photograph the ocean floor at extreme depths. The Halibut descended to the coordinates, lowered the Fish on a cable, and began photographing. The wreck was there, 16,500 feet down, more than 3 miles beneath the surface. The photographs showed a broken submarine lying in the darkness of the seafloor, its hull buckled, its missile tubes visible and intact. The images were sharp enough that analysts in Washington could read the hull numbers. 98 men were somewhere in that wreck. They had families who were told their husbands and fathers were missing. The Soviet government gave those families nothing. No location, no explanation, no ceremony. The men had gone to sea, and the ocean had taken them, and that was all anyone would ever officially say. The CIA looked at those photographs and made a decision that would take 6 years, consume more money than any covert operation in American history, and end with a 14-minute ceremony that no one was supposed to see for nearly 2 decades. They were going to steal the submarine, not the photographs, the actual submarine. They were going to build a ship capable of lowering a mechanical claw 3 miles to the ocean floor, grip the wreck of K-129, and pull it to the surface in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, in international waters, with Soviet naval vessels operating in the same ocean, without anyone in the world knowing what they were doing. Richard Helms, the director of Central Intelligence, approved the plan. He brought it to President Nixon. Nixon approved it. The initial budget estimate was staggering. The final cost would be $800 million in 1974 dollars. That is roughly $4 billion in today's money. For a covert operation, one operation. The first problem was the cover story. You cannot build a 600-foot ship designed to recover objects from the ocean floor without people noticing. Ships of that size require hundreds of workers and years of construction. They generate paperwork, payroll, permits, reporters. The CIA needed a reason for this ship to exist that Soviet intelligence and American journalists would both accept without looking too closely. The answer came from the strangest corner of American life. Howard Hughes. In 1968, Howard Hughes was the most famous reclusive billionaire in the world. He had built TWA into a major airline, produced Hollywood films, and broken airspeed records. He had also, by the late 1960s, withdrawn from the world in a way that made headlines by itself. He lived in sealed, darkened hotel rooms, refusing to see almost anyone, communicating only through a small circle of intermediaries. He had not been photographed in years. He was conducting business worth hundreds of millions of dollars from behind blackout curtains. He ate the same food every day. He wore tissue boxes on his feet because he was afraid of germs. He was, in other words, a man whose name was attached to such extreme and unpredictable behavior that anything done in his name seemed plausible. If Howard Hughes wanted to spend an enormous fortune building an experimental deep-sea mining ship, that was exactly the kind of thing Howard Hughes would do. Nobody would question it. Nobody would look too hard at the engineering details. If it was weird and expensive and connected to Howard Hughes, the explanation wrote itself. The CIA approached Hughes through intermediaries. Hughes agreed to lend his name and his corporate structure. His company, Summa Corporation, would officially own the ship. The cover story was deep-sea manganese nodule mining. Manganese nodules are small mineral deposits that form on the ocean floor. There was genuine scientific and commercial interest in harvesting them in the early 1970s. The story was plausible. The press bought it. Soviet intelligence analysts reviewed the project and concluded it was a commercial venture. The ship was called the Hughes Glomar Explorer, 600 feet long. At the center of its hull was a gap called the moon pool, an opening large enough to lower and raise enormous equipment through the bottom of the ship into the ocean below, while keeping the ship's interior dry. From this moon pool, a pipe string nearly 3 miles long would descend to the ocean floor. At the bottom of that pipe string was a device the CIA called Clementine. Clementine was a mechanical capture vehicle. A claw, the largest claw ever built for a covert operation, designed to grip a Soviet submarine by its hull and hold it during a 3-mile lift through the Pacific Ocean. The engineering had no precedent. The K-129 weighed approximately 1.4 million kilograms. It had been sitting at 16,500 feet for 6 years. The pressure at that depth is more than 700 times the pressure at the surface. The hull had corroded. Nobody knew if it would hold together during a lift. Nobody knew if Clementine's fingers would grip without slipping. The engineers who designed the system calculated tolerances that had never been tested at this scale. Their initial estimate for the probability of complete success was 10%. The CIA approved it anyway. Lockheed's Skunk Works division took the contract. The same organization that had built the U-2 spy plane in complete secrecy built Clementine and the pipe handling system under the same conditions. Workers fabricated components without knowing what they were building. The ship was constructed in Pennsylvania and fitted out on the West Coast. The operation was compartmentalized so completely that most of the people who built it had no idea what it was for. The Hughes Glomar Explorer sailed from Long Beach, California in June 1974, heading for coordinates in the North Pacific that fewer than 100 people on Earth knew. To understand what the CIA built, you have to understand what had never been built before. The deepest successful salvage operation in history, before Project Azorian had recovered objects from a few hundred feet of water, K-129, was at 16,500 feet. That is nearly 11 Empire State Buildings stacked on top of each other. The pressure at that depth crushes unprotected metal. The temperature is just above freezing. There is no light. Radio signals do not penetrate. The submarine lying down there had been through 6 years of that environment. Its hull slowly corroding, its compartments slowly flooding. The salt water doing what salt water does to steel over time. The engineers who designed the recovery system had to account for all of it. They designed Clementine's claw fingers from maraging steel, an alloy that is exceptionally strong under tension, stronger than most commercial grades of steel. They designed the pipe string to carry not just the weight of the submarine, but the dynamic loads that would come from the motion of the ship above, which would never be perfectly still. The Pacific Ocean moves. The ship moves with it. Every wave transmitted a small shock through 3 miles of pipe to the claw at the bottom. The engineers calculated those shocks and designed the system to absorb them. What they could not design for with certainty was the condition of the submarine itself. They did not know exactly what they would be gripping when Clementine closed. The workers at the Sun Shipbuilding and Drydock Company in Chester, Pennsylvania, who built the hull of the Glomar Explorer, knew they were building an unusual vessel. The moon pool in the center of the hull was unlike anything any of them had seen. It was a rectangular opening large enough to swallow a bus, designed so that equipment could be lowered through the bottom of the ship into the ocean below, while the ship's interior remained sealed and dry. The derrick structure rising from the deck above the moon pool was enormous, taller than a 15-story building. The pipe-handling machinery surrounding it could move sections of drill pipe with mechanical precision while the ship rolled in open ocean. What the workers were not told, and what most of them never learned, was what any of this was for. The compartmentalization was total. A machinist who fabricated a specific fitting for the pipe string was told it was a component for a deep-sea mining system and given no further information. A welder who worked on sections of the internal recovery chamber was given drawings without context. The complete operational picture existed only in the minds of a small group of CIA officers and senior engineers at Lockheed and Global Marine. The secrecy required to maintain this across hundreds of workers, multiple facilities, and several years of construction was itself an unprecedented management challenge. It mostly worked. There were moments when workers asked questions. There were moments when journalists noticed something unusual about the ship's design and made inquiries. The CIA's cover story held each time. Deep-sea manganese nodule mining, Howard Hughes, advanced commercial research. The story was credible because it was calibrated to what people expected Hughes to do, and what people expected Hughes to do had no lower limit on strangeness or expense. Life aboard the Glomar Explorer during the operation was defined by a tension that most of the crew could not fully understand because most of them did not know what was below. The pipe-handling crews worked in shifts around the clock, connecting sections of pipe, lowering them, connecting the next section, lowering again. 3 miles of steel descending through darkness in pieces. At any stage, a mistake could compromise everything. A dropped section, a misaligned connection, a moment of inattention. The CIA personnel aboard lived in a different psychological space. They knew what was down there. They knew what it cost to build the ship they were standing on. They knew the years of work that had brought this moment to the Pacific Ocean. Some of them had been working on Project Azorian since 1969. They had given 5 years of their careers to this operation. Now the pipe string was going down, and there was nothing to do but watch the instruments and wait. The voyage to the target site took 3 weeks. During those 3 weeks, the cover story was maintained at sea level, as well as on land. The Glomar Explorer looked like what it was supposed to be, an unusual commercial research vessel doing something expensive and technical in the Pacific Ocean. The crew wore uniforms with the Suma Corporation logo. The ship's documentation showed a commercial mining operation. When other vessels made radio contact, the answers were consistent with the cover. What the crew experienced during the voyage depended almost entirely on what they knew. The pipe-handling crews knew they were going to lower equipment to the ocean floor. They were skilled at their jobs, and they focused on the technical work ahead. The Global Marine employees who ran the ship's basic operations knew they were on an unusual charter, but had been told only what they needed to know. The CIA personnel aboard were running through contingencies. If Soviet vessels were in the area when they arrived, if the cover story was challenged, If something failed mechanically at depth, if the submarine wasn't where the photographs said it was where the photograph said it was. When the Glomar Explorer arrived at the coordinates and the positioning systems brought the ship to a halt above the target, the operation shifted into its most delicate phase. Dynamic positioning kept the ship within a few feet of its intended location despite the constant motion of the Pacific. The pipe handling crews began their work. First section lowered. Second section connected and lowered. Third section. Fourth. Hour after hour, day after day, the pipe string descended through the moon pool into the ocean below. Then a Soviet naval vessel appeared on radar. It approached the Glomar Explorer. Soviet sailors observed the ship from a distance. The cover story was maintained. Deep sea mining. Everything normal. End. The Soviet vessel eventually left. The CIA officer, who later described the encounter, said it was the most tense 3 hours of the entire operation. The claw was closing on a Soviet submarine 3 miles below, and Soviet sailors were on the surface asking what the ship was doing. The pipe string kept going down. Clementine reached the wreck. The operators guiding it worked from sonar readings and underwater cameras, unable to see the submarine directly, adjusting position in near-total darkness at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean. Getting the claw properly positioned around the hull took days. Then Clementine began to close. The lift began. 3 miles of pipe, inch by inch, pulling 1.4 million kilograms of Soviet submarine upward through the darkness. The tension in the system was at the edge of what the engineers had calculated it could bear. For several days, it held. At approximately 6,000 feet depth, 2 of Clementine's claw fingers fractured. The sound of it reached the surface as a deep shudder through the entire ship. The instruments showed the load dropping suddenly. The engineers read the data, and in the first seconds did not know if they had lost everything. Then the readings stabilized. Something was still in the claw. The forward section of K-129 was still being held. The rear portion, 2/3 of the submarine, had broken free and was falling back toward the ocean floor in the darkness. They continued the lift with what remained. When the forward section came up through the moon pool and was lowered onto the deck of the ship's internal recovery chamber, the CIA team went to work immediately. 2 nuclear torpedoes were recovered. Documents and equipment of intelligence value were found. The nuclear ballistic missile warheads were not in the section that was recovered. They were in the rear third, at the bottom of the Pacific. The codebooks that the CIA had most wanted, the cryptographic materials that would have allowed the NSA to decode Soviet communications, had been destroyed by 6 years of immersion in seawater. And in the forward section, in the torpedo room and the crew berthing areas, they found the bodies of 6 men. Nobody had planned for this. The operation was focused on technology and intelligence. The men aboard K-129 were adversaries, in a practical sense. They were crew members of a hostile military vessel. But they were also men. They had names in a ship's log. They had families who had spent 6 years not knowing where they had died. And now their bodies were on an American ship in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, and the CIA officers who found them had to decide what to do. The decision they made said more about the human beings involved in Project Azorian than anything else in the operation. On the 4th of September, 1974, the crew of the Hughes Glomar Explorer held a burial at sea with full military honors. The ceremony was conducted on the ship's deck. The prayers were read in English and in Russian. The American flag was present. A Soviet flag was present. The Soviet national anthem was played over the open Pacific Ocean from the deck of a CIA ship. The 6 men were committed to the sea in sealed metal caskets because of concerns about radioactive contamination from the nuclear materials nearby. A crew member filmed the entire ceremony on the direction of the senior CIA officer aboard. 14 minutes of footage. The officer later said he ordered it filmed because the families of those men deserved a record even if they could not see it for years. He did not know it would be 18 years. He did not know the Soviet Union would cease to exist before the film reached anyone. He knew only that this was the right thing to do. The operation was supposed to remain secret indefinitely. In March 1975, a journalist named Jack Anderson broke the story on his nationally syndicated radio program. He had obtained documents from a burglary at Howard Hughes's Los Angeles office. The Los Angeles Times published a full account. The CIA sought a court injunction to prevent further publication. The courts declined. The New York Times followed. Within weeks, Project Azorian was the subject of congressional hearings. When journalists asked the CIA to confirm or deny the story, the agency's response became one of the most famous phrases in the history of American intelligence. We can neither confirm nor deny. The Glomar response. It is standard legal language now, used by intelligence agencies, law enforcement, and government entities around the world whenever they want to acknowledge nothing. A CIA press officer invented it standing in front of reporters asking about a ship that was secretly stealing a Soviet submarine from the bottom of the Pacific Ocean. The congressional hearings that followed Project Azorian's exposure were part of a broader moment of reckoning for American intelligence in the mid-1970s. The Church Committee was already investigating CIA activities. Watergate had ended Nixon's presidency. The country was in the middle of a sustained examination of what its government had been doing in secret. Project Azorian landed in the middle of all of that. A 6-year, $800 million covert operation conducted without meaningful congressional oversight, using a private citizen's name and corporate structure as a front, targeting a vessel that belonged to a nuclear power with whom the United States was ostensibly at peace. The hearings were not gentle. The CIA's defenders argued that the operation was exactly the kind of thing intelligence agencies exist to do. The Soviet submarine contained nuclear weapons, communications technology, and cryptographic materials that could have transformed American understanding of Soviet military capabilities. The opportunity to recover it was unique. No other nation had the engineering capability to even attempt the operation. The 10% chance of success was worth taking because the potential value of what could be recovered was incalculably high. The fact that the operation partially failed was not an argument against attempting it. It was an argument that the engineering challenge was genuinely difficult. The critics argued that $800 million was an extraordinary sum for a 10% chance that the operation demonstrated a pattern of intelligence agencies conducting major programs without accountability, and that the diplomatic risks if the operation had been discovered in progress were never adequately weighed. What would have happened if a Soviet vessel had identified what the Glomar explorer was actually doing while it was doing it was a question the CIA had no good answer to. The legal exposure under international maritime law was real. The diplomatic consequences of being caught stealing a military vessel belonging to a nuclear power could have been severe. Neither argument won the hearings definitively. The CIA's budget was not cut. The oversight reforms that followed applied to intelligence activities broadly. Project Azorian was neither declared a success that justified its methods, nor a failure that discredited its planners. It became, like so many Cold War operations, a story about the gap between what was attempted and what was achieved, told in a language of partial declassification that left the most important questions still classified. The engineers who worked on Project Azorian moved on to other projects. The deep-sea positioning and pipe handling systems they developed found applications in the offshore oil industry, which was expanding rapidly throughout the 1970s in response to the oil crisis. The North Sea fields and the Gulf of Mexico developments needed exactly the kind of precision deep-water equipment that Lockheed and Global Marine had built for the CIA. Some of the engineers who had worked under strict classification spent the rest of their careers applying what they had learned to commercial drilling operations. The technology outlasted the Cold War that had required it. Sherman Wetmore, one of the lead engineers on the Glomar Explorer, was in his 80s when the CIA hosted him at its headquarters in Langley, Virginia, in 2022 to mark the operation's anniversary. He stood in front of an oil painting of the ship and talked about the engineering problems they had solved. He described the tolerances they had worked to and the calculations that had kept him awake at night in 1973 and 1974. He did not talk about whether the operation had been worth the money. He talked about the problems that had been solved and the way his team had solved them. For Wetmore and the engineers around him, Project Azorian was the most technically difficult thing any of them had ever done, and the fact that it had partially failed did not change what they had built to attempt it. What Wetmore remembered most specifically, according to the account the CIA published of his visit, was the moment the positioning system held the ship over the target for the first time. The Glomar Explorer had been designed to maintain its position within a few feet, despite wind and current and the rolling motion of the Pacific. In testing, the system had worked. At the actual site, above the actual wreck, with 3 miles of pipe hanging below, the system had to work in conditions that no test could fully replicate. When it held, when the instruments showed the ship stable above the coordinates and the pipe string descending cleanly, Wetmore said the room of engineers went quiet in a way that he had not heard before and has not heard since. Not celebration, something quieter than that. The recognition that the thing they had built was doing what they had said it could do, 3 miles above a Soviet submarine on the floor of the Pacific Ocean, and that for the moment at least, it was enough. In 1992, after the Soviet Union had dissolved and Russia and the United States had a different relationship, the CIA provided the Russian government with a copy of the 14-minute burial film. What that meant in practical terms took years to unfold. The Soviet government had told the families of the K-129 crew that the submarine had been lost and the cause was unknown. This was technically true. The Soviet Navy genuinely did not know where the submarine had gone down. What they had not told families was that the Americans had found it, that it had been partially recovered, that 6 of their men had been given a military burial by the intelligence service of the enemy nation, that the entire ceremony had been filmed. Some families had spent years holding on to the hope that their husbands and fathers had survived and been captured. A submarine missing in the Pacific during the Cold War, with no wreckage, found left open the terrible possibility that the crew had lived and been taken prisoner by the Americans. It was a hope with no basis in reality, but it was a hope, and some families had carried it for more than 2 decades. The film ended that hope. It also gave something in its place. It gave certainty. It gave location. It gave the knowledge that the men who found those 6 sailors had not treated them as enemy combatants or as intelligence assets or as bodies to be studied. They had treated them as sailors, as men who had died in service to their country, as human beings deserving of the ceremony that all sailors deserve. Boris Yeltsin received the film and the classified briefing that came with it in 1992. Accounts from people present at that meeting describe him as visibly moved. The Cold War had officially ended. The Soviet Union was already dissolving. And here was this 14-minute film of Americans burying Soviet sailors with full honors in the middle of the Pacific Ocean in 1974, playing national anthems for both countries, treating enemies as equals in the only way that ultimately matters, which is in death. What Yeltsin made of it politically is unclear. What he made of it personally, based on the accounts of those who watched him watch it, was something closer to grief. Maruso Kante. The families of the 6 men who appear in the film learned where their men were buried, the Pacific Ocean, somewhere northwest of Hawaii, in water too deep for any recovery. It is not nothing to know where someone died. It is not the same as having them back, but it is something. The families of the other 92 men have no film. They have only the knowledge that the submarine was found, partially raised, and that the section containing most of the crew fell back to the ocean floor when Clementine's claws broke at 6,000 feet. There is no plan to go back, no technology that could do it economically, no strategic justification in a world where the Cold War has been over for 30 years. The K-129 has been on the ocean floor for 56 years. The nuclear torpedoes that were not recovered are still there. The missiles pointed at American cities are still there, inert, their fuel degraded, their warheads corroding in the dark. The CIA's internal history of the operation, partially declassified in 2010 after decades of Freedom of Information requests, calls Project Azorian one of the greatest intelligence coups of the Cold War. Critics point out that the most valuable materials fell to the bottom when the claws broke, the code books dissolved, the ballistic warheads were never recovered. $800 million produced intelligence of uncertain value from a submarine that had been underwater for 6 years. Vladimir Kobzar, the commanding officer of the K-129, was 42 years old when the submarine left Petropavlovsk on its final patrol in February 1968. He had been in the Soviet Navy for more than 20 years. He had a wife and children. His personnel file described him as an exceptional officer, meticulous in his procedures, demanding of his crew, reliable in his judgment. He was the kind of officer who made routine patrols safe because he took the routine seriously. We know his name because the CIA's declassified history mentions the K-129's command personnel. We know his rank and his age and his evaluation record because those details survived in the records that were examined when the operation was first planned. We do not know what happened on the morning of the 8th of March, 1968, when the K-129 went silent. Nobody does. The CIA's history says only that there was a catastrophic accident. The cause is described as unknown. The most detailed single document about the submarine's final hours is the acoustic recording from the SOSUS network. And that recording tells you only that something in the North Pacific imploded at depth on a certain date at certain coordinates. It does not tell you whether Kobzar was in the command chair. It does not tell you whether there was warning or whether it was instant. It does not tell you what he thought in the last seconds, if there were last seconds. The ocean does not give up those details. It keeps what it has. Kobzar was not among the 6 men recovered during the operation. His wife Irina had waited in Petropavlovsk with their children through the spring and summer of 1968, and then through every year that followed. The Soviet Navy paid her a pension and told her nothing. The submarine had been lost on patrol. The cause was unknown. The search had found nothing. That was the official position, and it remained the official position for 24 years. What Irina Kobzar knew about where her husband had gone and what had happened to the submarine she served on was nothing more than what the Soviet state chose to tell her, which was close to nothing at all. She knew the ocean. She knew submarines sometimes did not come back. She had known this when she married a submarine officer, and she had lived with it for every patrol before the last one. What she had not known, and what the Soviet Navy had no particular interest in telling her, was that the Americans had found the submarine 6 years after it sank, and had attempted to raise it, and had partially succeeded, and had buried 6 of the crew with full honors, and had filmed the ceremony, and had kept the film for 18 years, while she continued to know nothing. By 1992, when the film reached the Russian government, Irina Kobzar had been waiting for 24 years. Whether she was still alive to receive the information about where her husband's submarine had been found is not documented in the publicly available records. Many of the K-129 crew's family members had aged significantly by the time the Cold War ended and the information began flowing. Some had died. The families who could be reached received what could be given them, a location, the knowledge that the submarine had been found. For the 6 whose men appeared in the film, a 14-minute recording of a ceremony conducted in their honor by the people on the other side of the war that had taken them. Kobzar's body, along with the bodies of 91 other crew members, is in the section of the submarine that fell from Clementine's broken claws at 6,000 feet in the summer of 1974. He has been at the bottom of the Pacific for 56 years. The ship's log notation he made on the morning of the 8th of March, 1968, if it survived, is somewhere in the darkness at 16,500 feet in the North Pacific, in the section of the submarine that no American ship has ever returned to. The 6 sailors who were recovered and buried at sea were not named in the CIA's publicly available records for many years. The details of who they were remained classified. Their families received the film, but not always the names attached to the bodies. In some cases, the identifications were uncertain. The Russians subsequently provided more information through their own research into the submarine's crew manifest, and over the years, some of the 6 have been identified with greater certainty. But the full story of those 6 men, their names, their ranks, their histories, is still not entirely public. What is public is that they were on a Soviet ballistic missile submarine during the Cold War, that they died when the submarine sank in 1968, that their remains were recovered by the CIA in 1974 as an incidental consequence of an operation aimed at recovering nuclear weapons and codebooks, and that the CIA officers who found them decided, without instructions from Washington, that these men deserved the same ceremony any sailor deserves. That decision was made by people operating under enormous pressure, in the middle of a covert operation, in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, in the middle of the Cold War. It was not required by any regulation. It was not ordered by any superior. It was a human response to a human situation, made by human beings who looked at what they had found and understood that the political categories the Cold War had imposed on these men did not determine what they deserved when they were dead. Project Azorian was conceived as an intelligence operation. It became, in its most lasting effect, a story about that decision, about what people do when the systems that define their world, the Cold War, the ideology, the classified objectives, the $800 million budget, come face to face with something that those systems have no procedure for. Something simple. 6 men, a ship, an ocean, the basic question of what the living owe to the dead. The CIA got a partial submarine. They got 2 nuclear torpedoes. They did not get the codebooks or the warheads. They got the Glomar response, which has proven more durable than any of the intelligence they recovered. And they got 14 minutes of film that arrived 24 years late at the homes of people who had waited for it longer than they should have had to wait. The K-129 is still down there. The men on it are still down there. And somewhere in the darkness at 16,500 feet in the North Pacific, the rear section of the submarine that fell from Clementine's broken claw in the summer of 1974 is resting exactly where it landed. Nobody has seen it since. Nobody is coming for it. The declassified CIA history runs to 50 pages. It describes the engineering with precision, the operational decisions with care, the intelligence results with the measured language of an organization that does not easily admit failure or unambiguously claim success. It does not dwell on the 6 bodies. It does not describe the ceremony in detail. It mentions the burial at sea in 2 sentences. The 14-minute film says more in those 14 minutes than 50 pages of operational history. It says that the people on that ship in the summer of 1974, in the middle of the Cold War, in the middle of an $800 million covert operation aimed at recovering weapons designed to kill American civilians, looked at 6 dead men from the other side and understood that the side they were on did not determine what they deserved. That is what $800 million bought. Not the codebooks, not the warheads, not the intelligence victory that justified the budget. A 14-minute film. And the knowledge for the families of 6 Soviet sailors that they were not forgotten by the people who found them. Thanks for watching this one all the way through. If you enjoyed it, leave a like. It helps the channel more than you'd think. Subscribe if you want to see what comes next. See you tomorrow.